Greetings and hello to everyone. This is the Business of Betting podcast, and I'm your host, Jake Williams. Today is episode 40, and we have Darren Potter joining the show. Darren started betting professionally in 2008 and is focused on Victorian horse racing. Darren talks about money management, the skills required to be both a form analyst and a betting expert, whether you can be out of form when doing the form, track walking, and a myriad of other insightful betting topics. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Betfair. Betfair operates a betting exchange and is licensed in the Northern Territory of Australia. Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au and support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Please gamble responsibly. As always, you can find us at businessofbetting.com or at bettingpod on Twitter. Please fire in any questions or feedback and potential guests you would like to hear from. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy my chat with Darren Potter. Today I'm joined by Darren Potter. Darren, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Jake. It's a pleasure to be on board. I've listened to most all of your podcasts. I really enjoy them, and you've had some wide and varied guests on. And I would think for anyone that's keen to make a profit out of punting, that your podcast would be a great place for people to start.
Much appreciated. I certainly agree, Darren. I'm looking forward to chatting to you as well. I was on your site having a look around, Darren Potter Assessments, and I saw you started professionally punting in 2008. What was the impetus, or was there a tipping point, I guess, pre-2008 that led you to become a full-time pro punter?
Well, I'd always been a very keen carnival punter, I suppose, and had an interest in racing from a young age. But in 2008, I sold a recruitment business that I'd run for about a decade. And, it just gave me the opportunity to give it a try. I'd always wanted to try betting for a living and professional punting, and it was just an opportunity to do it. And I thought I'll give myself 2 years and see if I can make a profit. And I've made a profit every year since, thankfully, and I've never looked back.
So was it a long time coming, and were you thinking about it for a while, or did you just sort of sell the business and thought, all right, what's next? Let's give this a go?
I vaguely remember being as young as 18 thinking, God, it'd be just, I'd go to the races and you'd see people, the bookmakers, and so just be a wonderful thing to be able to make a living out of something that you enjoy so passionately. When it actually became a realistic thought, I don't think, it was probably around the time when I sold the business, because from the mid-90s through to then, I was working in various corporate jobs, and that's what I was doing. So I didn't really, the carnivals would come around and I'd take punting quite seriously, but the rest of the time I was just working. So, obviously when I sold that business, an opportunity was there and I took it.
So what was that year or the first year like? I know just from listening to some of the guests I've had on, there's so much that goes into being a full-time professional punter, whether it's sports betting, horse racing, whatever. What was the beginning like? Did you have a background knowledge about some of the different areas? Were there things you had no idea were coming down the line? Take us through, year one of being a pro punter.
Okay, well, as I said before, I'd been betting at the carnivals fairly seriously for a number of years, and with mixed success. So I was only going to bet on horses, and I was, I was living in Sydney at the time, and that was where I was doing the majority of my betting, so I decided to kick off in Sydney. So I decided I needed some additional professional help. So I'd spent, I probably first started doing my own markets in about 95. So I'd spent, over a decade developing my skills at pricing horses. And then about the time I decided to give it a go, I discovered a thing called the Punter Show. I'm sure I might have the timing slightly out, but anyway, I watched a whole bunch of episodes of the Punter Show, which was Dallas Baker, Mark Lambourne, and Glenn Pollitt, and Mark spoke to me in a way that made a lot of sense to the way I go about things. So I immediately, upon commencement, got Mark's sets. And was intrigued with the way he priced horses. So when I actually started betting for a living, from the word go. I was actually weighting things probably 80% towards Mark's markets and 20% my own, and trying to back, the key runners in the races that I targeted, and that evolved over time. And I continued to educate myself and improve my skills to the point where my own markets were more important to me than the outside help I was getting from people like Mark.
So take us through that making your own markets process, and I guess the pricing aspect. Do you price everything to 100%? Do you have sort of categories where you might have, 1, 2, 3 horses in certain categories and things like that? What are some of the things you think about?
Yeah, so I price every race to 100%. I start with the favourite, then I work back from the favourite in lengths and margins, and I because I'm of that age, Jake, I think in the old imperial odds. And I use 4 rolls to the length, so 4 rolls of the old-fashioned board.
Yep.
So if I mark the favourite 6-4 or $2.50 in for the younger viewers, listeners, and then I've got a length back to the next pick, it'll be 4 rolls. So it'll be $2.80, $3, $3.20, $3.50. So I'll have the second pick $3.50, so to speak. So I'll continue back through, and then once I've put a price beside every runner's name, I'll just tweak it to get it to 100%.
So do you look at the marketplace before you do that, or you go in blind essentially and you have no idea what the market has the favourite at?
Yeah, definitely going blind. I don't care. I mean, often I'll do races before there is a market. Sometimes the market's already up. It just depends on the timing of my week. But I always do it myself first, and have my prices for the 4 top picks, what I would consider the key runners in the race, before I go and look at the market. And then when I do go and look at the market, if it's fairly close, I'll just leave the market alone. If there's a reasonable discrepancy between my prices and the market, I'll look at how many bookmakers are up and what options I've got to start building a position on ones that I think might be overs early in the marketplace.
Will you go back and reassess, I guess, your form analysis if you've marked something 6-4 and it's 8-1, or how much of that sort of market influence comes into your price assessment?
That doesn't happen a lot often, but where there can be differences in horses that are on the fringe of the market, I might have marked something $10 and the market's 25-1 or longer, or vice versa, and I'll have a second look at those horses. Usually with the favourite and the favourite runners in the market, it's unusual for there to be a big discrepancy. But so when there is a discrepancy, my instant position is to try and think why, and then try and identify whether it's me that's made an error or it's them. What's most likely? What are the likely thought processes behind that price? And then go from there.
And is that obviously different on a Tuesday or Wednesday versus a Saturday or a carnival time? Is it all a constant evaluation depending on how liquid those markets are, if it's after 9 a.m. and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, like I won't if I've done my market for a race, let's just say it's for a Saturday race and it's on a Thursday, and there's a reasonable let's say significant difference between my market and the public market, I won't let that worry me at all. But if the market hasn't started to come in line with where the position I'm in by Saturday morning, I'll start to look for reasons why. So for the Saturday races, by sort of 10 o'clock on race day, those markets are pretty solid.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to get into a little bit more about form and a few other things. Before we do, can we switch over to money management? And I read a few things on your site. You'd mentioned the Kelly criterion. What are, I guess, your main principles when we talk about overall money management and, I guess, preserving your bank to be doing this long term?
Well, the whole principle of the Kelly stuff is just betting to where the edge is and weighting your bets towards the edge. So I think the exact formula is the edge divided by the odds expressed as a percentage of your bank. So, I mean, that's just the way I think about all racing. If I don't know where the edge is, I'm not betting in that race.
And is edge as simple as the market price versus how you've assessed it?
Yes. So in the end, every bit of I gather all sorts of information. From when I look at a race, the first thing I do is get the race in front of me in barrier draw order. I don't like looking at it any other way. I produce a speed map to start to get a feel for that race. I'll have my base ratings and what I expect out of those horses coming into this race. I'll go and walk the track and get an idea of where the better positions are going to be on the course, if there is any advantage. And all of those factors I'll try and bring together and express in my assessed price. So at the end of the day, if I'm saying the favourite's a $2.50 chance and the second pick's a $5 chance, I'm saying that there's a 60% chance of those two horses winning the race. And if the market's saying it's 50%, well, then I've got an edge over the market in my view.
Yep, no, it makes sense. Makes sense. And what's it like in 2018 to be able to, I guess, consistently get whatever your bet sizing is for that individual bet or market or even race day? Is it easy enough to be able to bet consistently as you would like to, or are there situations where you're unable to do that?
Oh, look, you have to work hard, but it's okay. You know what I mean? Like you can get, the volumes that I bet in, it's manageable. I wonder, sometimes the big teams, I wonder if I would think they rarely get the whole lot of their bet set. But I tend to get most of it, and you have to be prepared to average your price out over the full extent of the market. If I try and, I rarely try and take all of my position in one bet. If I do that, I create problems. So as long as you're prepared to average it out over the full course of the market, and you're willing to be clever about it, and bet across the board with all the operators and that sort of thing, you can get it done.
Okay, and are you ever going to tracks to bet with on-course bookmakers these days?
No, rarely. It's a disadvantage, Jake. The flow of information, and it's the way I work. I review a lot of races and I review them extensively. And like the races, particularly that I'm betting on, I actually review them during the meeting. So as soon as they go across the line, I rewind the footage and I watch it half a dozen or so times. And that's hard to do when you're on course. And so the minor advantage you can get occasionally being on course these days with some of the wingers in the betting ring taking different positions, the minor price advantage you might get doing that is outweighed by the other stuff. And clearly with all the action happening online these days, you need to be in a situation where you, as much as you can, trust your IT infrastructure. And when you're on course, that's out of your hands to an extent. So the few times I've gone, I've found it, a disadvantage is probably the best way to put it.
Rethink the way you see sport. Every action or play can be represented by a series of numbers. When you analyse this data, patterns begin to emerge. If you follow these patterns and develop systems, you can play the game within the game. Betfair.com.au. Gamble responsibly.
Okay, and so what can you be doing to monitor the online marketplace? Are there things you do, whether it's through dynamic odds or monitoring Betfair? Do you have a network of people you speak to? What are your approaches to being able to understand what's happening real time with the markets?
Yeah, all of the above. So there's a network of people I talk to, particularly on race day. I've got quite a few contacts that get stable information and that sort of stuff, which I'll just take on board, and some of it I'll react to and some of it I won't. Obviously have dynamic odds up all the time, and particularly on race day, I'll be paying very close attention to the Betfair trade. And once we get past sort of about midday on race day, a very large percentage of my bets from that time onwards go through Betfair.
Okay, and why is that?
Oh, just at that stage, the market's pretty settled, and they're all just reacting to each other, and the percentage is just slowly coming down, and they're tending to follow Betfair. So if you can sort of be thinking ahead of the game as much as possible, you can pick things off at the top of the market on Betfair and just improve your position slightly.
So once you've finalised your pricing and you sort of understand, I guess, the race as much as you can, do your bets change based on the market? I mean, if there's a $3 chance that gets out to $6.50, are you likely to then back that because of the, I guess, perceived edge there, or are you not touching it because of the market drift? how do you approach, I guess, a marketplace that can fluctuate?
Well, you could give me two different races with the exact same betting dynamics. You might have a $3 out to $6.50 favourite, and I'll react differently to both because of my understanding of the reasons it's happened. So if I understand the reasons why it's happened and I think those reasons are legitimate and that horse is the original price, just say I might have marked it $3 as well, is false, and there's new information available that means that the correct price for that horse might be something closer to $10 or whatever, then I will reduce my position on that runner. Alternatively, if I think the market's making a mistake, I'll just keep backing it on the way out.
So what are some reasons why it might be false, for example? Are you talking about it just went up way too short, there's a bias, there's wind, there's the jockey's not going so well? What type of information might sway you?
I'm trying to think of a good example of one when that's happened.
Is it certain stables that you're happy to follow or follow out? Is it depending on a million factors that just become a soup that in your head and it's hard to explain?
Okay, look, I've just thought of one. So here's a good example. So recently there was a race at Caulfield and there were two equal favourites in the early market, Twitchy Frank and Paris Rock. They were both around the 2-1 mark. Now, as the race got closer to jump time, there was a groundswell of support for Twitchy Frank because the track was a likely leader, and there was on-pace runners were sort of dominating the card. The map was slightly tricky for the other runner. Twitchy Frank was more experienced. It had cities form. There were a number of reasons why the big teams and the bigger players, the players that have the biggest impact on the market, were being attracted to that horse, and it started to shorten. Right, so it was at least $2.50. It could have even been shorter from memory. Now, once that happens, something's got to happen with the other runners. Okay, they have to move in relation to each other.
Yeah.
Okay, so there was a couple of middle pinners in that race. They were there was a first upper called Earth Angel and a Darren runner that was up in distance that were slightly fancied. So their prices weren't budging. So something had to give. And the only horse that was left to be a victim in the market was Paris Rock. So it got out to very late in betting, close to $4 on Betfair. Now, I mean, I think at one stage it was probably favourite around the 260 mark on, say, Friday. And here we are they're going into the gates and this horse is getting out towards $4. Well, I was happy to keep backing it. In my mind, that was just a pure case of the momentum getting behind Twitchy Frank. There was a map component to it. I was already on Twitchy Frank at a reasonably good price. I wasn't worried about it, and I was not one bit concerned about the drift on Paris Rock. It just seemed like an attractive opportunity to me. So that's just an example. That's the sort of thing that can happen. But
interesting.
There are a lot of other cases where horses drift dramatically, and you just know that the horse is not right. It's to do with the soundness of the horse. So
okay.
when I think it's a case of there's some stable information that's leaked out, and it's Betfair's leading the charge, and there's an obvious soundness issue with this horse, I'll be very cautious with them and try and minimise the damage.
So for just a regular Saturday punter who doesn't do the work you do, is there a general rule that's worth thinking about? Is it, if something goes from $3 to $6.50, in general, be cautious, or is there a general rule at all, or is it just you've got to evaluate everything?
I think the closest you can come to a general rule is if they don't have a price, as if if there's a layer on Betfair that doesn't care what price they're matching on the other side of the bet, that's a real red flag. And that's both ways. Like sometimes they're willing to just keep backing a horse no matter what price, whatever's up there, they'll just take.
Yep.
So that's less the case. It's more prevalent the other way when they're willing to lay a horse at any price that had traded at a much shorter price earlier in the market. That's the best thing you'll get to a red flag when there just seems to be no price. But sometimes it can be people trying to manipulate the market. So I'll give you an example. Last Saturday at Caulfield, The opening favourite in the 3-year-old colts race was Villamont at about the $5.50 mark. 10 minutes before jump time, it hit $9 on Betfair and it ran $4.20. So
wow.
There were players that were using Betfair to try and drag out the other corporates and the on-course market to get it out to a point where they wanted to back it. So they were willing to expose themselves on Betfair to do that. And then in the last 2 minutes of backing, the support for that horse was relentless. I mean, it got beat 5 lengths. It didn't have much luck. It didn't win. But that's the nature of the game that we're engaged in. It's like chess on steroids, I like to describe it.
So how often are you betting on 2, 3, 4 horses a race?
Pretty much every race. There are very few races where I only back one horse. It doesn't happen. It happens a handful of times a week at most. I back at least 50% of my market in each race that I target.
So take us through the rationale for those who think it's, obviously only one horse can win, but take us through that rationale. Are you saying, okay, these 3 horses have 60% chance of winning the race based on these prices? The market says they've got a, 49% chance, so I'm going to bet all 3, and I know long-term that's okay. Is that how you think about it?
Yep, that's it. That's exactly right. So, and I think the reason I do that is because the more runners I include in my bundle in this race, the less it reduces the margin for error. So it's easy to make a mistake on one horse. When you're pricing to 100%, if you're doing 2, 3 or 4 horses and you're getting to 60% of your market, the chance of me being far out on my overall percentage on those 4 horses is it narrows. And obviously once you get to 100, if you were to back every horse in a race, well, there's no chance you're making a mistake.
Yeah.
The chance of there being a win is 100%. So I'm saying if I put in a lot of work and take into account all the available information I can, and I'm looking at 3 or 4 horses in the race, it really does narrow the margin for error and it makes my results consistent.
No, that makes a lot of sense, actually. I haven't heard it explained in that way, to be honest, but it makes sense if your, outliers and things like that sort of get meshed into the overall results, I would imagine.
Yeah, and to answer one of your questions you asked earlier about how do I react to the market? So there was a race at Sandown last week, just to give an example. The favourite was around the 5-2 mark, so $3.50, and the second favourite was around the 4-1 mark in the morning line. Okay, now it was a race where those 2 horses were hard to price individually, so I had them pretty close to the market price. But I was confident that the collective price of the 2 runners together was accurate. So I'm saying that about 48% in those 2 runners was really close to the mark. Now, as the race got closer, that favourite started to drift and it got out past $5 and the other runner started to shorten. So I was prepared to continue to back the runner that shortened, which was the horse was called Heptagon and the other one was called it escapes me now. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I was prepared to back the Heptagon horse on the way down because if there was a problem, and it seemed to be a soundness problem with that other horse, why it was drifting so badly, the majority of the percentage that it wasn't taking up had to go to that other runner because it had a clear advantage on the rest of the field.
So what about when you're bundling them up, like you mentioned, is there a preferred bundle? Do you like to have, a leader and then a horse that might sit 3rd or 4th the fence, for example? Is that a better bundle than having a leader and a back marker and someone sitting midfield? Do you think of it in that detail, or you just don't care? You put them together based on your price assessment and that's the bundle?
Well, effectively, all those factors are taken into account with my prices. But if I've walked the track and I think the vast majority of the winners at that meeting are going to come out of the on-pace runners, which I consider to be the first 4 in run, I will try and back as many of those on-pace runners as I can. Now, if I think the track's really fair and it doesn't really matter and the strongest horses will come to the fore, then I won't be so concerned about targeting the on-pace runners. So it really depends. So I nearly always try and walk the track before I do my first set of prices. So because walking the track gives me a lot of clarity on which parts of the field I would prefer to target.
I want to get into that track walking part. Before I go to that, on the weekend there was Redzal, let's say Red Zell and Ball of Muscle. Prefer to have those two in your bundle versus, Serpedo or Redkirk Warrior, who are probably coming from the back. In those instances, is that a preference because they're both going to be on speed and Red Zell's going to be just outside and hopefully or maybe dictating a little bit to the leader, or is it always dependent on the track? It's always dependent on a number of different factors.
Yeah, it's dependent on a number of different factors, and you've picked a straight race, and the betting off maps in straight races can be a very fraught business. Now that's a great example of a race that I didn't bet in, I didn't target because the favourite was too short, in my opinion, and the market was the rest of the market lined up very neatly with my market. So that's typical of the sort of race I try to avoid. That would be when you've got a dominant favourite like that, they're hard races to bundle up runners and use my method.
Yeah. Well, because there's 5 or 6 around 7, 8, 9, 10 to 1.
Yeah, so you got the dominant favourite, who I thought was too short. I'd marked at $2.20. It was $1.80.
Yeah.
And then the next 3 picks are all in the $8 to $10 range, and there's not a lot between them. So it's just there's no edge there for me.
Okay, so let's get into track walking. How did it start out? How do you decide one day, unless you've grown up with it, let's say, or you're involved in preparing tracks? How do you get started doing track walking?
Well, some of your former guests, Mark Lambourne, used to talk a lot about track patterns and the way tracks raced in different rail positions and so forth, and that got me interested in it several years ago. And then Vince Arcadi, another one of your former guests, would talk about lanes and how they perform. And now at the time, I wasn't in a position, I was in New South Wales and wasn't geographically placed to go and look at the tracks. But about 3 years ago, I moved to Melbourne, and I was at a function with some punters. The first week I was down here, I talked to a guy called Trevor Lawson, and Trev has walked all the tracks in Victoria for this part of a decade or more. And I just asked him some questions about how you got access and that sort of thing. He said, "Look, they all encourage it. It's not a problem."
How do you get on the track? People who've been to the races probably think they're not going to let me just walk down the Flemington Straight. How do you get on there?
Well, you sort of look when I'm walking them. It's not the day of the meeting.
Okay.
I sometimes I do go on the day of the meeting for a second look, but I typically try and walk the track on Thursday afternoon, exactly 48 hours before the meeting starts, so I can get a good feel of what it's going to be like by race 1, or race 2 or whatever.
Yeah.
But so all the tracks in Victoria are accessible to the public, really. So in Caulfield's case, it's Crown Land. It's actually a public park. They only lock it up on race days.
Is that right?
So if you go to Caulfield on any day of the week, there'll be people walking around there with their dogs and that sort of thing, and joggers and all sorts of people. So not so much at the other places, but they're all easy to get into, and the track staff are very welcoming. If you go and introduce yourself, I've become very friendly with all the track guys at all the courses. So if I want to go out on race day and have a look at an hour before race 1 or something like that, I always call the track manager because I've come to know them, and they don't mind me providing me with access. But so it's something that they want good, truthful information to get out there in the marketplace, because just the nature of punting, when something goes wrong for punters, the first thing they do is look for who they can blame. So it's either the horse, the trainer, the jockey, or the track. So so a lot of misinformation gets spread on social media and that sort of thing. So as a way of combating that, the track managers actually like really good information to be out there, and they get very frustrated with journalists and that sort of thing that write comments about the track when they haven't taken the time themselves to have a look at it.
So is it an art or a science? I mean, what are you out there looking for? I've seen jockeys sometimes out there, and I'll get to that in a minute about what they're looking for, but they've got, looks like umbrellas or some type of stick that they're poking into the ground. What are you doing when you're walking down the straight?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the answer is. It's somewhere in the middle of an art and a science. I use a scoop hole, but whatever you use, as long as you use the same thing every time. And I always go and have a look at some of the where they've raced recently, or where they've been working on the track in barrier trials or track work, and look at how deeply the indents are, the markings are on the track. and that's how far I push my pole into the course as I'm assessing it. So I do that. I've developed the right level of pressure, and I know by how far my pole goes into the ground, as to how that track will race and rate. So it's just one of those things you get a feel for if you do it over and over and over and over and over again. So, I spend at least probably 45 minutes walking the course. If it's Flemington, it's longer, and if it's Moonee Valley, it's shorter. But so if you imagine doing that at least twice, 2 to 3 times every week, you just get a feel for it. You can feel where there's firm spots and soft spots, and where some of the course preparation equipment's had an impact on the track. And you're looking for anything that's going to provide an advantage of maybe a length over, say, 1,400 metres or over a mile or whatever. So it doesn't need to be very much. We're looking, racing's about tiny margins, and if you can say, right, these sort of circumstances are going to advantage that horse or those horses by a length, that can make a huge difference to your price.
Why isn't every jockey out there doing it?
The problem for jockeys, Jake, is that they're just so busy. You know what I mean? I've worked with some jockeys over the time, and I've tried to talk to them, and it's very hard because they just like I said last week, I went out to Flemington on Thursday, and I spent an hour and a half at there. So I walked the straight course first, and then I did a lap, and then did the inside of the home straight. And I spent 2 hours trying to find any little advantage that I could, and so forth. So while I'm doing that, those jockeys, they're riding at Pakenham, and they're at Moonee Valley on Friday night. They might have been at Werribee on Friday during the day. They're doing track work. I mean, they don't have the time to get prepared ahead of time like I do. So they turn up at the races on Saturday, and they've probably only got 15 minutes to go out on the track and have a bit of a look around. And because they don't do it over and over and over again, and they're at so many race meetings, it just doesn't have the same impact on them as it might on me. Now, some of them are better at it than others, but as a general rule, the jockeys just tend to follow each other.
And I've heard Vince talk about lanes. Are you on board with that approach and that theory? I spoke to someone recently about it. They said even if you found the lane, you can't be guaranteed the horse is going to be there. So in terms of a forward-looking approach, it's tough. Maybe backward-looking, you can add some sort of value or take away some value from runs. What is your thoughts on the whole idea of a lane or lanes?
Yeah, look, the tracks in Victoria are very good. The amount of times where there's a real lane advantage is, it's less likely than likely, but there are times when it is in play. It is very helpful in your post-race assessment if you know there was a lane that was an advantage and you're able to know which horses got the benefit of that on that day. That'll help you, next time those horses run. That'll provide you with an advantage. Now, in the leading up, it can be very tricky. You might think this horse is going to have the opportunity to go to that position first, but if the jockey's not aware of it, it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. So it can be a bit fraught leading into races. I think it's good to have an idea where the advantage might be if there is going to be one, and try to target the horses that have the best chance to utilise that opportunity. But it won't always work out for you. But in the post-race, it's very valuable. Now, a lot of what Vince has talked about is particularly relevant to Sydney, and a lot with Randwick over recent years. And what Vince is talking about there with what was originally Lucky Lane 8, it was very relevant. It was extremely important to know where Lane 8 was in relationship to the rail. So obviously when the rail true, it was 8 lanes out. When it was at rail and 6, it was only 2 lanes out. You had to know where that lane was. And they've done things recently, I think, to try and alleviate that issue. But I don't bet in Sydney anymore, so I'm not really sure where that currently stands. But in Victoria, the tracks are generally very good.
So I want to talk about how you do the form in a sec, but before we do, why didn't you stay in Sydney? Was it a racing issue or a betting issue, or was it just circumstance and other issues?
Yeah, well, there were a number of issues, but, from a racing point of view, I'd started in Sydney. I'd bet exclusively there for at least 4 seasons. At the time, I lose track of my time, but I'm thinking about this. I was discussing it with the boys on the racing rant the other day, and I couldn't remember exactly which year at all when the transition exactly happened. But so for the first 4 years at least of betting professionally, it was in Sydney exclusively. And the only times I bet in Melbourne were during the Spring Carnival. And one of those Spring Carnivals, I just thought, wow, the racing's just different down there. I'm going to extend it out this year. And I kept doing form in Melbourne for a further 3 months and found it to be very, the opportunities for my type of betting were richer in Victoria. So for a period there, I did both. Then with the dominance of the, particularly the Chris Waller stable, but the top stables in Sydney, it was just getting tighter and tighter up there. And there's a much bigger gap in New South Wales between the provincials and the Metro horses. In Victoria, the structure's a lot flatter, and that leads to more opportunity and greater depth in the fields and greater depth in the betting market. So I got to the point where I was much more focused on Victorian racing, and I'd sold some property in Sydney. I had an opportunity to move. So my wife and I packed everything. We sold most of everything we owned, and what was left we put in the car with our 2 old English sheepdogs, and we came to Victoria.
That's really interesting.
The Betfair Exchange isn't a house that sets the odds. It's betting at its purest. One punter's opinion against another's. Play the game within the game at betfair.com.au. Gamble responsibly.
So let's talk about doing the form. Are you watching videos? Are you pencil and paper and going through the numbers? Do you have a supercomputer that crunches everything? Take us through, without going into too much detail or any proprietary information, but what are your general thoughts and approach to doing the form?
Okay, well, it's Monday today, so I'll start from there. So Monday at the moment is race-free Monday in Victoria, which is just wonderful.
Wow.
So today I'll review all of the meetings. I've already done a number of them, but the meetings that I haven't already reviewed that happened in the last 7 days in Victoria, I'll review today. So I start with the times, and then I'll do the videos, and then I'll focus more. If it's at the further out wide or the lower stand of the meeting, the less that will be. I might not look at all the. I look at all the videos to see where the winner was in run, because I want to use that as an assessment for whether there was any track bias. But in terms of in-depth study of the video and which runners were unlucky and that sort of thing, I'll only do that on the fast races out wide. And as I get closer into Victoria and the stronger meetings, I'll get deeper and deeper into that analysis. So by the time I've done it, usually by the time I've looked at every race in Victoria for the week, some jump outs and maybe a couple of interstate races, I usually review about 100 races a week, with a lot of that work happening on Monday. Okay, then I'll start looking at the Wednesday meeting, and sometimes I bet I'll find a race to target on Tuesday as well, so that I might look at 1 or 2 races on Tuesday, but I'm getting prepared for the Wednesday meeting, which this week's at Caulfield. So I'll get all the fields in front of me and barrier draw to start to do the speed maps for the whole meeting. And then before I get anything beyond the speed maps, I'll go out and walk the track. So I'll either do that this afternoon or tomorrow afternoon at Caulfield. So as an example, we've got 2 meetings this week at Caulfield, Wednesday and Saturday. On Wednesday, the rail will be at 14 metres, and on Saturday, it'll be back into the true. So it might as well be 2 different race courses. It's so different. So going out and walking the track tomorrow, even if I don't find any particular lanes or advantage, it'll just put me in the right mindset, and it'll give me some clarity for when I start nailing down the numbers for those horses, which lead to my prices. So once I've got the speed map in front of me, I've walked the track, I'll start to look at the platforms that those horses have got coming into each race, and I have a scale of performance that I use. That's it's not in line with the official handicap ratings, but it's in the same universe, if you like, but it's just a lot more compressed.
Okay.
And I think in lengths, so 2 points to a length, and so if on my scale a horse last start performance is 90 and it's meeting horses in the next race that's 100, it needs to find 5 lengths to be competitive with those horses, if that makes sense, right? So in like the Group 1 horses are performing at a level of 110 above, so that's there's very few horses that get to that level on my scale. The majority of Metropolitan Saturday races, if you like, are 1 in the 100 to 105 range, and the majority of midweek Metro races are 1 in the sort of 94 to 99 range. Some get to 100. And a lot of the provincial races are running the sort of one in the 86 to 94 range, if you like. So, when I say I review all those races in Victoria, each race has that rating for the winner and then works back in lengths from that winner for every runner. So I've got what performance they produced at their most recent run and all of their historical runs, and plus I'll have my benchmark figure that I expected from them in that race if it was a race that I previewed. So I'm looking at what I expect from that runner. As I said, I start with the favourite. Because I've done it for so long, Jake, when I look at a field and I say the top rated runner I've got on my scale at 100 and the second pick's 96 and it's got a 2-length margin, I'll go, okay, I just know straight away what a 6-4 chance looks like and what a 4-1 chance looks like, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, exactly.
So I start with the favourite, go, right, that's where you sit, and then I work back in lengths from that to price every runner. And then, as I said, at the end, I just fine-tune it a little bit to get it to 100%.
Okay. And then what about, speed maps and all that sort of stuff? Is that what's coming next?
So, no, speed map was first. So, if we're talking about me doing race 1 at Caulfield on Wednesday, I'll do the speed map today.
Yeah.
I'll walk the track this afternoon, then I'll start I'll use my database with my scale of performances on it. I'll start to put the ratings beside each horse, and I'll adjust them slightly depending on the tempo of this race and that horse's position and what it's about to achieve, what it can achieve. So it might have produced 96 at its last run, and I think all the conditions here, it's got a good position, it can get to 98 here. So I'll put 98 in the thing. And like I said, if the top pick in the race is 100, that means I've got it 1 length off the top pick.
Yep.
So speed map first, then get a picture of how I think the track's going to play. So as I'm doing my expected performances, I'm looking at the tempo and where that horse is positioned and where it's positioned in relation to the top-rated runner in the race. That's something I always take note of. And I'm getting those numbers, trying to get them solid before I start. The last thing I do is the pricing. It's the last piece of the puzzle.
So you have all the information on paper and in your head, and then you go and finalise the price assessment.
Exactly. So I have the computer in front of me, but as you're talking about, I've got a piece of paper in front of me. I have a big pad that I have one pad per month that regular viewers of my YouTube show will see. I always have that pad in front of me. So the results are all in the back and the previewed races are in the front of that pad. And I do that to try and help paint a mental picture of the race for myself leading into the race. I'd like to just have this mental picture of how this race is going to be run, where the runners all fit and so forth. So, I do that for a whole bunch of reasons, but one of the real value parts of that people might not expect is when I see support for a runner in the market that I might not have backed, I instantly think, why are they backed? Like the picture I've formed for this race in my head will give me clues as to why they're backing that horse. And it almost in a subconscious way will trigger in me, yes, I need to cover myself on this horse and make sure I don't lose if it wins, whether I need to build a position on that horse and make it a winner for me, or whether, no, they're making a mistake backing this horse, I'm happy to let that horse go around against me.
So sometimes something will just click based on seeing the market move or changes, and then you'll look at what you've done and think, oh, I missed that or overlooked that or haven't priced it in enough?
Exactly. So I think the mental picture I paint for each race going into it, when the market starts to move in certain directions, it always triggers something in my subconscious that sort of help me use my instinct to decide whether I've made a mistake, the market's making a mistake, which direction I need to go in.
That's just thinking about pre-2008 and probably the fun you had betting carnival time doing 20 minutes of form, and now what it's evolved into sort of 10 years later, it's pretty spectacular.
Yeah, look, I feel grateful every week and every day I get up, and this is what I get to do because I enjoy every week. I'm sure that comes through to the punters that get my services and the ones that watch the stuff on YouTube and so forth. That I'm sure it's very evident that I really enjoy everything about racing. I enjoy the puzzle that it is, and as I said, chess on steroids, and thinking about it and the mental challenge that it is. It's exciting.
So what about on a Saturday then? Once you've done all that and it's 1 o'clock, is it fun then on Saturday? Are you just have 4 or 5 screens open and placing some bets and playing real time chess, or is it still a analytical, detailed approach during your Saturday, and you've got to be mentally switched on for 6 hours in a row, and then once it hits sort of 5:30, you can sort of switch off?
Yeah, it's I don't know if I really enjoy it. I find it rewarding and challenging, but I don't know if it's fun, because it will like a day. A race meeting will drag you in all sorts of places that you didn't expect to be dragged to. And I think things will happen that you just don't expect, because it's just it's an intriguing game full of all sorts of characters, and it's very competitive, and people will do what they have to do to win. So, you've got to be open to the possibilities. For a Saturday meeting, I've started doing the work usually on a Wednesday. I've done more work on Thursday, additional work on Friday. Usually by about lunchtime on Friday, I've sent some information. I've completed my pre-meeting preparation, if you like, pre-race day preparation, and the information's gone out to my subscribers by about lunchtime on Friday, and then it's usually a Friday night meeting that we're involved a little bit in or whatever, and I won't think about it again until Saturday morning after scratchings, because the scratchings can have a significant impact on the card. But I'll have done some betting. I've started to build positions in certain races, and then on Saturday it's really about rounding out those positions and then reacting a little bit to what's happening in the market. But my whole approach is to try and stay as much as I can at least one step ahead of the market if possible. That's what I'm trying to do. That's where my edge is. And I'm working extremely hard to try and stay and anticipate what direction the market's going to go in and what's going to trigger certain moves in the market, and anticipating those, that creates the edge.
So this is a serious question. How do you have a week off?
The only full week off I have all year is the week of the Warrnambool Carnival. It's just,
yeah.
I find it, if I have a 2 or 3 week off somewhere on the line, it's so hard to catch up. Just doing the way I do things, if I took a month off, it'd take me probably at least a month to catch back up, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I enjoy doing what I do so much that I don't mind. It doesn't worry me. There are a lot. That's the downfall of my chosen profession, is that I don't get to take big chunks of time off. But on a week-to-week basis, I think I have a very enjoyable lifestyle, because while I work really hard, I'm working really hard at something that I thoroughly enjoy. So as opposed to running a recruitment business, I'd never want to go back to running a recruitment business, I can assure you.
You mentioned about the sort of the Saturday part where you're taking positions, trying to stay ahead of the market, even predicting, I guess, moves. Is that betting component, which is, I would say, completely different to doing the form, is that a completely different skill set that you need to manage and I guess enhance as you continue to do this?
Absolutely. It's a completely different component, and there are people that are very good analysts that are no good at betting, and there are people that are very good at betting and aren't very good analysts. So, that's how different the skill sets are. I think my analytical skills are probably better than my betting skills, but over the years my betting skills have just improved, and I can tell the difference when I'm punting really well. I can improve the results of my sets, for instance, by some very clever moves that you make that just anticipating where the market's heading.
Yep.
So my set might have been plus 20 on the day, and I might have made 30 units. You know what I mean? It makes a very big difference at the end of the year. Or the days where the set might lose 25 units and you only lose 5 because you've covered a few extra bases or something. So And when I say the set, I mean I have a pre-meeting betting plan, which I think is a key component of what I do. So I think you have to have a foundation for what you're doing on that day. Then you can build changes on top of it, and those changes are only minor. But if you go into a race meeting without some kind of a plan, I mean, it's just too tough, in my opinion. The marketplace is brutal, and if you put yourself in a position to be dragged from one place to another by emotion, the market will destroy you.
So this might be a strange question, but can you be out of form from a sporting perspective, an athlete's perspective? Can you be out of form doing the form? And I don't mean necessarily, just variance in terms of results, but is there times where you think, yeah, I'm just not doing this well at the moment for whatever reason, or it's not clicking right now? Is that something that you can understand and manage, or is it just this is the process, follow the process, and all that variance or not doing it as well today and doing it a little bit better tomorrow will take care of itself?
Well, you've been asking great questions, Jake, because in most of your questions you've given alternatives that are both true. So
I'm just making them up and trying to figure out in my head if it's a stupid question or not half the time. So
no, it's a good question. No, form's definitely a part of it. There are times when it's just working. The form goes in cycles. Okay, so there are parts of the form cycle that are easier to deal with than others, and you can only understand that and be aware of it if you've done it over and over and over again over a series of years. And over time I have become more aware of parts of the form cycle to be less aggressive in. I don't think you can predict it to a point where you can say, okay, this part of the form cycle I'm going to not bet in, and I'll wait till it comes, till it gets to a point where it's more reliable and I'll start betting again. I don't think you can do that. I've had it suggested to me by a lot of people that I've discussed it with, but I just think it's a mistake. But so
would you pull back though, or would you?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just. So I bet a proportional Kelly stake and I allocate that to a race, and it's sort of I work in a range, and when I'm in a difficult part of the form cycle, when I say the form cycle, I'm talking about because racing's so seasonal in Australia, and you have these crossover periods where you'll have, say, when you're running from winter into spring, and then spring into summer, and then right now as we speak, we're in that period, the crossover period between the summer horses and the horses that are early in their campaigns from an autumn point of view. And I'm saying right now the last couple of weeks they're a difficult. It's a difficult period to deal with, so I'll be at the conservative end of the allocation of the proportional Kelly allocation for each race. I'll be now as the form starts to develop over the next few weeks. It'll become apparent to me at a point where I can start to move up towards the more aggressive end of that scale. So it's hard for me to talk about it in really black and white terms because it's something that happens progressively. But because of the way those form cycles work, it can make you feel like in the term you use, that you're out of form. Or at other times when things are running really good for you, you can feel like you're really in form. Now, there was something that I heard on one of your previous podcasts that you did with Dominic Byrne that really interested me, and I've sort of adopted it because I was doing something like it, but it wasn't exactly. And Dominic Byrne mentioned on the days where his computer is running really well, and it just seems like the circumstances are suiting that day. So in the term you used, his form's good that day. He has a second bank that then he utilises on that day to increase his level of commitment on that day to take advantage of days when his form's good. I think that's a really interesting concept, and that's something that I've tried to fold into what I do to an extent anyway.
Yeah, it is an interesting one. A lot of people who are purely analytical or focus on the mathematics might say that it may not be the best approach. I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it as well, but it's an interesting idea and concept, and basically factoring in things you can't quantify or understand is something that human beings struggle with in general. So if that's what it is, and you're trying to factor in something that you just can't quantify or understand, but you know it's there, is a very interesting topic that would need a lot of research and understanding, but it's worth talking about, I would imagine.
Yeah, well, I'm talking very specifically about racing, and I'm saying it's seasonal and it goes through cycles. So I'm saying that's a component of racing that I've got no idea if it's applicable to other betting mediums. I wouldn't know how that applies to sport or anything else. I just know it's a factor in racing. And the key component there that I didn't get to in my previous answer, and you were touching on, is you have to have an extremely robust process. So when things get tough, you've got something to fall back on that allows you to just put emotion to the side. And you just go back to the process and go, right, step one's doing the speed map. Step two is understanding what the track pattern is likely to be on the day. The next step is looking at the platforms the various horses have got and what they're likely to be able to achieve in this race, and then price it. So all of those steps, they just never change. I do that exact process for every race, every time, no matter what the part of the form cycle is. I just go through the same process. So when I'm, in inverted commas, out of form, it just gives me something to form back on where I'm not but trying to pull myself apart and in all sorts of directions and whatever else. And then I just look at the prices at the end of the day and they'll tell me whether I can bet or whether I can't bet in that race.
Yep. No, and in racing specifically, you might lose a few short half head or nose finishes and you might be doing fine or great and you're just not getting the results, and they will balance out eventually, I'm sure.
Absolutely. That's a key component of it. Like I often, I communicate a lot with my subscribers and I say to them a lot, like, if we're missing out on a few photos, but we're in the finishes. The important part is that we're collecting regularly. Like my whole process, I said I back 50% or more of my market in every race, which means in theory, if my markets are reasonably accurate, I should be collecting in more than 50% of the races I'm betting in. So we're collecting regularly. We're in a lot of finishes. Where we need to worry is if we're backing horses regularly that are just not in play at all. That's if that happens, then I need to just take a step back and look at what I've done over that period and just see if anything needs tweaking. But my whole approach, I've got some things written down on my desk that I try and stick to every day, and that's first of all I've got to know, I have to know where the edge is. I have to stay sharp. I have to stay mean, which means staying mean's a really important aspect for punters that are new to it. That you don't. One of the times you're at your most vulnerable is when you're running really good and things are going your way. That's the time you never want to give any money back to the market easily. You want to make sure that every bet you have is a bet that counts and there's an edge in it. And be patient. And I also try to remind myself to use my natural instinct.
You see the numbers. You want more control. On the Betfair exchange, you can back, lay, trade and set your own odds. So join the world's largest peer-to-peer betting platform. Get into the game within the game at betfair.com.au. Gamble responsibly.
So how hard is the running the business part? And I had a look on your site and you mentioned something which I rarely see, and it was achievable prices. And most people here in the US, gambling Twitter in general in the US is... let's say, not always the nicest place in the world to be, but a lot of it is about, releasing prices at the wrong time or saying it was available when it was available for 3 or 4 minutes and those type of things. So seeing achievable prices was actually pretty refreshing. How hard is it to manage a business while doing all of the things we've already discussed? And was that something you, I guess, factored in and anticipated, or has it been more than you anticipated?
Well, look, I operated as a professional punter in the background quietly. No one knew who I was for several years before I ever considered having a subscriber-type product. A guy called Dallas Baker talked me into, well, not talked me into it, but encouraged me to do that probably 3 or 4 years ago now. So the important part was, Jake, is when I started doing it, I knew that it was going to win. Well, you have to have, if you're going to provide information to a subscriber base, you don't know what's going to win, it's almost certain to lose. Okay, because whatever emotional roller coaster you might have doing just your own betting, that will be magnified dramatically if you're providing that information to other people and you're costing them money. So by the first time I ever offered anything publicly, it, in my mind, was extremely robust. And I had all the tools to fall back on if things got tough. And of course, when I first offered the set, the first 4 weeks it lost. Of course, that's what always happens. And and I said to Dallas at the time, look, don't. I think we went the first week we might have had 20 customers, and by the week 4 we had 3 left. And I said, just don't say a word, just let it go along and wait till we've got something to talk about before we ever talk about it again. And I think I won 12 of the next 14 meetings and had a huge spring carnival. And halfway along that, at the time, Robbie Waterhouse was providing a service through the punter show the same as I was, and one of the stewards in Sydney decided he wasn't going to allow Robbie to do that anymore because he was a licensed bookmaker. And as it turned out, a lot of Robbie's customers come over to my service, and we won like a high percentage of the weeks over that spring carnival. So I've never looked back since then, and my customers have done well. Now, the problem with this day and age, Jake, with the way social media is and the internet these days, anyone can offer something these days, and they can make all sorts of outrageous claims. And unfortunately for some of these people, they haven't learned how to win properly themselves before they've offered it to other people, and they're trying to learn on the run, which I can't. The difficulty of doing that, I can't even imagine how difficult that would be. You really have to do it in your own space and time, and make sure that you completely know what you're doing before you offer to anyone else publicly. Otherwise, you're just asking for failure, I would say.
Yeah, and it sounds very stressful doing that, but obviously that's what happens too much on social media, and I guess that's why you need to, do your research before you're throwing money away and signing up for those free tipping services or $10 a day and things like that if you're not completely sure it's what you need.
Just to probably answer your question thoroughly, like in my case, I want to make sure that the results that I report on my results page mirror the experience of the customers. So the prices I put up are the prices that they would have been able to achieve given when the information was available to them and what the market did. So, and I see it as a virtue that often the subscribers will have done better than the results I report. I think that means that they've done a really good job with the punting side of it that we were discussing earlier. And good on them if they have. If they've taken that information and improved the result with some clever punting, they should feel good about that.
No doubt. And at least it's, like you mentioned, it's achievable. They've got an opportunity to achieve those results, and that's all you can really ask. Obviously, you see, NFL games where it's -6.5 for 5 seconds, and it's -7 or closes -7 or -7.5, and they put out -6.5, and it's just not ideal in many respects. But yeah, it was refreshing when I read it that way because it certainly gives them the opportunity to be successful at those prices.
Yep, absolutely.
So I'm cognizant of your time, Darren. I really appreciate it. One more thing before I let you go. What type of content do you consume? Do you listen to podcasts? Do you listen to the radio, RSN, or things like that? Do you watch TV shows about racing? How do you mentioned a few things before about staying sharp. Are there things you would suggest for others who are, spending a lot of time doing this and might be looking for different outlets? What's some of the best places or places they can find some things to help their punting?
Well, sadly, mainstream media these days is a bit, it's information lacking substance for the most part. So I look for the more niche stuff. The Business of Betting podcast, great place to start. And I would say to people that are going to try and bet for a living, the first podcast they should listen to is the one you did with the guy from the investment bank that talked about the Kelly betting experiment that he ran.
Yeah, Victor. Yeah, that was fascinating.
Victor, if you want to bet for a living, you need to understand those concepts. You can have your own version of them, but you need to understand betting to the edge. And anyone that wants to bet for a living and make a go of it would need to be able to do that experiment and achieve the maximum payout that they were offering, because as long as you manage your bank sensibly in that process, you will get to the achievable result. If you overbet the edge, you will go broke. And if you bet tails when the toss is rigged against you, you will go broke. So,
yeah, we laugh about it, but it's not that standard across the board.
Yeah, well, the two key things that punters need to understand is not overbetting your edge and not betting when the edge is, when you haven't identified an edge. So in that case, the people were being told that the toss was rigged towards heads, and some still wanted to back tails. So you'd need to beat that out of yourself before you ever tried to make a living out of punting. I read books. I try and. I mean, the amount of the number of good books on punting is fairly limited. It's a very limited space, but some that come to the top of my head was the one on one that Patrick Veach wrote. I think it's called Enemy Number One.
Yep.
That's a really good read. That for people that particularly are into horse racing and trying to get an edge there. That Patrick goes through in some detail his process. Looking back in time over how he won a lot of money off the corporates in England, and I think there's some value there. I enjoyed reading after you had what's his name, the UK Harry Finlay on your podcast. I got hold of his book and had a read of that. That was entertaining. But Harry's what an intriguing character he is, and full of good insights.
Definitely.
So those type of books, I'm always interested in that type of thing. I was an avid viewer of the Punter Show back in those days, back in 2010, 11, and 12, and 13. But since that's become the racing rant these days, and because I'm so Victorian centric these days, and they're Sydney, it's become less useful to me personally. But for people that are betting in the Australian market, watching what the guys produce there is of great value. There's shows like mine. There are other ones out there. There's just the more niche stuff that's available on, either YouTube or podcasts and stuff like that. There's just some good information out there.
Have you read A Man for All Markets?
I haven't. No, who wrote that? I'll write that down.
Edward Thorpe. That's highly recommended.
Yeah. I've read a bit about Thorpe because one of the first books I read, particularly on the Kelly criteria, was
Fortune's Formula, maybe?
Fortune's Formula by William Poundstone, and that's a really good examination of the history and the principles behind Kelly, and I really enjoyed that. So I'll have a look at Thorpe's book for sure. Yeah,
it's a very, very good book. Before I let you go, Darren, tell us about your site, and you mentioned the videos as well. Tell us a little bit about that and what you're offering, and how if anyone's interested in what we discussed today on the podcast, they can reach out to you, send an email, or what the best way to do that for them is.
Yeah, well, look, Jake, I'll just be really straight up and honest with people here. As they might have picked up with here, the number one thing for me here is my own betting. I'm my own number one customer, if that makes sense.
Yep.
And the only way I'm going to be of any use to any of my customers is if I win myself. If I'm not winning, it's no good to them. So I've never tried to push the subscription business to any great extent. I like it being small, and I like the group of customers I've got. They're the right type of customers, ones that understand punting, are willing to ride the ups and downs, and they once they find me, they tend to stay. So that's the way I like it. So I've never made any attempts to really push my website. That's why people probably would not have heard of me or not seen my stuff previously. So it's just Darren Potter Race Assessments. There's not a lot of information on there. The page that gets by far the most traffic is the results. The results page gets updated daily. And I've got a YouTube channel in the same name, just Darren Potter Race Assessment. So, I mean, really doing the show each week is just a release for me and some of the other professional punters around Melbourne. We get together and just talk about issues related to racing and what's been happening and how we've been going, and just which stables are hot at the moment, which ones aren't, just various trends and that type of thing. We tend to try and do it on Monday because that's the quietest day for all of us, and most weeks we get to do it. And this week I won't be doing it because I'm doing the business of betting with Jake Williams instead.
There you go. Great option this week, Darren.
That's it.
I really do appreciate your time. It's always fun to speak to the pros. I obviously don't live in Australia anymore, so this is one of my, I guess, releases, as you said, is getting to speak to the best out there about what they're doing, and it certainly helps. So I really appreciate your time, and thanks again for coming on the show.
Well, next time you're betting in any Australian racing, Jake, whether it's from the US or you're back in Australia for the Spring Carnival or something, make sure you contact me, mate. I'll provide you one of my sets free of charge, and hopefully it'll help you get something out of those bookies.
You're a good man, Darren. You're a very good man. I appreciate it.
Good on you, Jake.
Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au, and please support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Gamble responsibly.